Good morning. It's really good to be here with you all. I might have a picture for you. I don't have a picture for you. I was going to have a picture for you of a cute baby in footy pajamas because there's really no better introduction than that. It might be a blessing in disguise because if I showed her to you, you may just want me to bring her up here and let her babble at you for 45 minutes. But I was going to bring her up by way of saying I might be a little bit tired. Right now, the coffee is counteracting that currently, but that little baby I was going to show you decided it'd be fun to have a party last night from about 2 to 4 and the 2 nights previous. And so if the coffee wears off and I get tired, I might start to wander a little bit. So we're going to start with the Reformation and how that affected the Christian view of work. But we might end up, who knows where. I think Stan is teaching on assurance. I could say some stuff about that, so we might just kind of go right into that. But no, really it is a privilege to be here, to get to consider the impact of the Reformation on not only the church, but really the world at large, because its impact was extensive, to say the least. And also to consider, it's good to be considering how the Reformation might impact us again, because I think it certainly has some things to offer our world today, us today, particularly in how we think about work. So yeah, that's what we'll be talking about. Because time is fairly limited, I'm really only going to be looking at Martin Luther's view of vocation. And under that, work falls under that umbrella for Luther, so that's really all we're going to get a chance to look at. And quite frankly, we're not even going to look at all of that. 45 minutes sounds like a really long time to a lot of people, but when you start putting a talk together, especially on the Reformation, you realize how much you just can't get to in 45 minutes. For instance, one I wanted to mention, just because I'm really not going to touch on it, is the evangelistic role that work plays in our lives. That's so important. We're going to see that we're called to engage with the world. We're called to go to the world for the sake of saving the lost. And do you know where the lost is at? 40 hours a week, a lot of them. They're at their jobs. They're working. And that's really all I'm going to get to say on that. And so all that to say, there's a lot that we could look at. So we're just this is really barely an introduction to the Reformation and how it affects work. But I'm excited to look at what we are going to look at. And it seems immediately apparent to me that this is a timely issue. Although at the end, I'm going to leave you with a quote from Dorothy L. Sayers, who was writing about, 70-ish years ago, and said some things that are still relevant to us. So it's been timely for a long time, but as citizens of the West, which since you're sitting in this room in America, I'm assuming you are to some extent a citizen of America, a citizen of Western culture, and assuming that, then we really have nothing if not extreme relationships to our work. And I'll explain kind of what I mean by that. But first, I would like to pray for our time today. Father, it is a privilege to work, particularly because we get to work with you and for you, particularly because we get to be, I would say, stewards of your glory in the world through our work. And that's just an incredible honor. I pray that you would take sort of my offering of words here and thoughts and change our hearts with them, that you would use it beyond beyond the sum of its parts. We love you. We thank you for how you're working in our lives. We pray that you would engage us with your ministry of work. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So yeah, I'd say as citizens of the West, we have nothing if not extreme relationships to our work. What I mean by that is there's generally two sort of attitudes toward work in our culture. The first is that we look at our work as our identity, right? One of the first questions we often ask somebody when we're trying to get to know them is, what do you do for a living? What do you do for a living? Which just shows how sort of deeply rooted this idea that our work says something about us is in our culture. We think that's a really important way to sort of understand who somebody is. Like, what do you do with your time? What do you do for your job? What do you do to make money? We think that's really important. And this often can get taken to a really unhealthy level, this idea of our work being our identity, and which results in workaholism. I read a statistic from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development from 2017, as I was preparing, that said in America in 2017, the average worker worked 1,780 hours a year, which works out to about 34 hours a week, which doesn't sound too bad. Like 34 hours, especially for anybody working full-time, that sounds like, oh yeah, it's not too bad. It's a good work-life balance. What you have to consider with that statistic, though, is that it takes every worker in the country into account. So part-time workers who are working as little as 10 hours a week, and temporary seasonal workers. Basically, if anybody got a W-2 in America in 2017, they were included in this statistic. And when you total all of those people's work hours together and average them out, you get to about 34 hours a week. Which means that for full-time workers, 30 to 40 hours is the typical, we think of as a typical full-time load. I would venture a guess that the average full-time worker is working many more hours than that. And I just saw Graham out here, and that's his job, is stuff like this. So he gave me the thumbs up, so that statistic should be relevant. But I would also guess he could tell you something about how much people work, and it's probably unhealthy, would be my guess. But so that's our first view of work, is that our work is our identity. The second view that we often see in our culture of work is that work is drudgery. Work is drudgery. It's terrible. We're working for the weekend. We're working for retirement. We're working so that eventually we don't have to work anymore. We're working to get out of work. That's the other attitude. And often, if not always, and I think this is really interesting, you see these two attitudes actually mixed together to some extent. So you basically have people working tons of hours and hating every minute of it, and just trying to get to retirement. So that I think is kind of the two general views we see in our culture of work. As Christians, I think it should be easy to see that these aren't healthy views. These aren't biblical attitudes toward work. For instance, against our work being our identity, we have prohibitions against idolatry. We're told that nothing should have a higher place in our lives than God. And yet work often does occupy a higher place in our lives than God. And then against work as drudgery, we have admonitions like work heartily as unto the Lord. Work heartily because you're working for God. We also have prohibitions against laziness, particularly in Proverbs, I'm thinking of. So it should be clear that neither of these two attitudes that we see so often in our culture are appropriate for Christians or are consistent with the Bible. So then, what is our response to these views? How do we view our work? What's the Christian view of that? I think the Reformers, and Luther specifically, for our purposes, have something to say to us, can help us answer that question. But first, I think it's important to sort of have a brief understanding of how Luther, the church at Luther's time, got to where it was in its view of work. So we're going to just do a really brief snapshot of kind of the view of work through history before we look at how Luther thought of vocation and work under that umbrella. And then we'll see how that can apply to us. So historically, I think the first thing that's important to know is that for much of the history of the world, work has not been viewed in a positive light. It's been viewed as a bad thing, as sort of a necessary evil. Perhaps the earliest known story in the entire world is the Mesopotamian creation epic called the Enuma Elish. And it basically tells the story of some kind of two sets of gods, one higher up kind of set of gods and one lower down set of gods, and they battle for control of the cosmos, and one group wins out and creates the world, and they create humans after this epic battle, and they create humans so that the humans can take over the work of running the world for them, basically, so that they can just be free to pursue leisure and pleasure and not have to, do work. And that's the first, arguably the first story in the entire world, and work is viewed as something to be avoided immediately. Then if you fast forward to Greek thinking, you have in Greek mythology, in Hesiod's works and days, you have hard labor coming out of Pandora's box. So the story of Pandora is sort of within the story of Prometheus. Pandora was a woman that Zeus creates, she's beautiful, but she's insatiably curious. And so Zeus creates her and gives her to Prometheus' brother as a way of punishing Prometheus. And they get married, and Zeus then gives them a wedding gift, which is this box. And he tells Pandora, here's this box for a wedding gift. It's full of all kinds of cool gifts, like really nice things, but don't open it, okay? You got to keep it closed, though. So, of course, the curious woman, that doesn't last for very long. She tries really hard to not open the box, but eventually does, and out come not good gifts, but all of the evils in the world basically come pouring out of Pandora's box. And one of those evils in the world that's specifically mentioned is hard labor. It's hard labor, it's work. Work is one of the evils that comes pouring out of Pandora's box. And Aristotle really dictates the Greek ideal of work when he says that happiness seems to be found in leisure. For we deny ourselves leisure so that we can be at leisure, and we fight wars so that we can be at peace. Basically, he's the first one to express the idea that we work so that eventually we don't have to work. We work for the weekend, we work for retirement, we work to get out of work. Aristotle was the first one to say that, ultimately. And that really defined the Greek view of work. Jewish thinking, on the other hand, was exceptional. You see, Jewish thinking was influenced by the story of God in the beginning laboring. This was really it was just unheard of in the ancient world that a God would work. And what did he make man out of? He made us out of dust. He was in the dirt. God was working in the dirt. Not only was he working in the dirt, but every time he completed a day of work, he looked back on it and he said, "That's good. That's good. I did something awesome today." He was enjoying his work. This was a really revolutionary view of work. And so Jewish thought is really one of the few exceptional paradigms in the ancient world in which work is viewed as a good thing. And so Jesus comes on the scene, born a Jewish man, but living as a subject of the Roman Empire, who espoused the typical Greek view of work. And really, Jesus adds something that's lacking in both views. See, he adds the sense that work is not only a good thing, but it's a sacred thing. It's a sacred thing. It's a participation with God in the building of his kingdom and the running of the cosmos. So upon the completion of Jesus' work on earth, work that, quantitatively speaking, I want to point out, was primarily being a carpenter. Upon the completion of his work, the divide between the sacred and the secular was destroyed, or maybe more accurately, torn apart. We see this in the tearing of the veil in the temple after Jesus' death. And now, obviously, the work of Jesus has wide-ranging implications, had wide-ranging implications for his followers, and some of those implications had to do with work. You see, it's been noted in biblical scholarship that the creation account in Genesis is reminiscent of temple building accounts in the ancient Near East, in ancient Near Eastern literature. And we can actually see this in the temple building account that we have in the Old Testament. So God leads Solomon to build a temple, build a place for God to dwell in the midst of his people, Israel in this case, and then sets up certain men, priests, to run the temple according to how God instructed it to be run, and according to how God set it up to be run. And if you think about the creation account, this is essentially what we see. God himself creates a place for him to dwell among his people, right? In this case, it's all of mankind. And he sets up a man, he puts a man, Adam, in charge, sort of representative of all men. He puts them in charge of running that dwelling place according to how he instructed it to be run, according to how he made it to run. And so we see that Adam and mankind are really set up as priests, as sort of priests in the temple of the world, to run the world, to support the running of the cosmos as God designed it, to the glory of God. Then, of course, sin comes into the picture, and it forces God to separate himself, to create. That's when we first see the sacred secular separation, is when sin comes into the world. But again, in the work of Jesus, we see the reversal of that separation. And so, this means that once again, God's people are called to serve in the running of the dwelling place according to how he instructed it to be run, according to how God designed it to be run. And so, this means that every occupation, every job, has the potential to contribute to the proper functioning of the cosmos that God created. Every job has the potential to contribute to the proper functioning of the cosmos that God created. And it was this reality that contributed to a Christian work ethic that confounded the pagan world after Jesus. People who would work hard and happily. People who would work hard and happily. For a few centuries after Christ, Christians were known as this industrious people working in and for the good of the culture. One of the articles I read in preparation for this put it this way: to do anything for God and to do it well was the fundamental hallmark of authentic Christian faith. Unfortunately, by the end of the 3rd century, you have church fathers starting to use this term, the contemplative life. They start talking about the contemplative life. And this is really a term that came right out of Greek philosophy, which for the Greeks referred to the philosophical life of leisure. For the church fathers in the 3rd century, it was exemplified in the life of priests and monks and nuns, or the clergy. Then by the 11th century, celibacy was established, and the line between clergy and laity was defined. And it's easy, as evangelical Christians, we sort of look at the faults of the Catholic Church a lot, particularly leading up to the Reformation, and there's obviously some good correction that needed to happen that we should be thankful for. I do, however, think it's important to note, just sort of out of fairness, that this sacred secular division that occurred, it happened during the Dark Ages. It was not a good time in history, and it was really an attempt to renounce the world, which as Christians we are called to renounce the world in certain ways. And so that's what they were trying to do, even though it was misguided and unbiblical. I just feel like out of fairness, we got to say, like, good try, but you missed. You missed the mark. But this is the context in which Luther comes on the scene. A church in which separation or removal from the world was esteemed, and where the clergy were seen as the only ones doing the work of the ministry, the only ones really serving God. And it was in this context that Luther set about reclaiming a biblical view of work as a part of the overall vocation of a Christian's life. It's important to understand that Luther's primary focus, or at least what we're going to be primarily focusing on, was reclaiming the whole of the Christian life as a vocation, the whole of a Christian life as a calling from God. So for Luther, there were two callings for Christians, generally. First was just the general call to be a Christian. That was the first call. The second call, put simply, was to live as a Christian. It was a call to be engaged in the battle of living as Christians in a fallen world, to be engaged in the struggle between the coming kingdom of God and the waning kingdom of the world. That was the vocational call for Luther. As one of the authors I read puts it, Luther's view of vocation is that vocation refers not only to one's occupation, but to all one's relationships, situations, contexts, and involvements, including, of course, one's occupation if one is employed. So for Luther, it was an overall call for the entire Christian's life. And it was not a call out of the world, to remove ourselves from the world for the purposes of serving God, but an incarnational call to live in the world in a redeemed way. You see, the clergy of his day, in their attempt to renounce the world, had separated themselves from the world for fear of being contaminated by the world, kind of. For fear of being led astray by the world. You see, they set up a paradigm where if you wanted to know God, if you wanted to have a relationship with God, you had to come to the church. Sinner, you have to come to the church, come to us, come to God. Luther, on the other hand, believed in engaging with the world, going to the world for the sake of saving the lost. For him, the call of every Christian was to mimic Christ in engaging the world and drawing the lost towards salvation. And that was the big difference. Was that the Catholic Church was saying, sinner, you have to come, and Luther was saying, no, we have to go. We have to go. Again, as one of the authors I read put it, just as God's redemptive act in becoming incarnate affirms that salvation is not an escape from creation, but a restoration and fulfillment of it, so also the Christian life will not be an escape from creaturely life, but a calling to it. The Christian life will not be an escape from creaturely life, but a calling to it. And what does this calling look like? Well, underlying Luther's view of vocation is actually his view of God's creative work in the world. Now, of course, he believed in God's initial creation of the cosmos, but he also viewed God's creative work as ongoing through his upholding and directing of the cosmos. And so, he viewed vocation as a participation in and a support of that created order, kind of like I mentioned earlier. It was a call to live in the world as God originally intended us men to live in the world, according to that created order. Of course, with sin being a reality, this is a struggle. It means we're going to struggle in the world. Because the obvious reality is that the world largely is not working as God originally set it up to work. And so engagement in that struggle for Luther is the vocation of the Christian. Engaging in the struggle of supporting the original intent of the running of the cosmos with God. So, how does this apply to work today in our American culture? Well, first, as I mentioned, work falls under the umbrella of vocation. The vocation is all of life. Obviously, work is part of our lives, so it falls under that umbrella. Therefore, Luther would say that we ought to work in such a way that we support the running of the cosmos according to God's original intent, and that we struggle through our work to redeem the fallen world back to how God meant it to be run. And I think to help us sort of understand what this looks like, I want to look at a definition of work. Tim Keller is a pastor in New York, and he has what I think is an incredibly helpful definition of work, and it reads as follows. Work is rearranging the raw materials of a particular domain to draw out its potential for the flourishing of everyone. Work is rearranging the raw materials of a particular domain to draw out its potential for the flourishing of everyone. Obviously, this is a bit of a heady definition, so I want to look at this in pieces. We're gonna cut it up and look at a piece at a time. And because there's endless amounts of jobs out there, and therefore endless amounts of application for this definition, I'm going to use my job as a project manager at Kaufman Homes as an example to hopefully put some flesh on the definition. And then also I want to start at the end of the definition and work backwards towards the front, because I think it's important to understand the overall goal of our work before we consider how we attain that goal. So, that being said, let's start with the flourishing of everyone. The flourishing of everyone. This is the goal of all Christian work. The flourishing of everyone. And we can see this clearly from the Bible. God's work in creation and redemption was for the benefit of everyone. And by everyone, I mean not only us, sinners who get to receive his grace, but even him who gets glory. He gets glory out of it. Everyone benefits. Everyone benefits and flourishes in God's work in creation and redemption. We can also see this at work in the law, in the Old Testament law, particularly in the law on gleaning, on leaving gleanings for the poor in the Jewish community. Basically, the Mosaic law said that farmers should harvest your field, but don't harvest all of it. Leave the edges. Leave the edges unharvested so that the poor of the community can come and gather some grain for themselves, gather some food for themselves. And we see Ruth doing this, right, in the fields of Boaz is a good example of that. But you can see that work was not designed, in the law, work was not designed just for your own benefit, just to make as much money as you could, as much profit as you could, just to harvest as much as you could. It was designed, yes, to provide the farmer with an income, but it was also designed to contribute to the flourishing and the overall health of the community, of everyone. So we see it in the law. And then in 1 Thessalonians 2:9, we see that we work so that we don't burden other people. It's just kind of simple, but we work so that we're not a burden to other people, but so that we can, in fact, bless other people. So, for me, in my job, I seek the flourishing of my clients by providing them well-maintained homes. I seek the flourishing of my craftsmen, my technicians, my subcontractors by providing them with work to do. I seek the flourishing of my employer by hopefully providing them with an efficiently run and profitable business. And I seek my own flourishing by having a job where I can make some money and provide for my family. And that's just a few ways in which my job can contribute to the flourishing of everyone. And I want to note here, too, that when a job is done right, when work is done well, it really does contribute to everyone's flourishing in a really incredible way. An example of this is sometimes, multiple times since I've been at Kaufman Homes, I've had clients just express gratitude for the work that we've done. And oftentimes it's really genuine, heartfelt gratitude. And every time it happens, I can't help but think to myself, like, you're paying us for this, right? This isn't charity, we're not doing it for free. I mean, we're expensive, right, Kent? We're not doing it for free, and yet there's this deeply felt appreciation for the work that we've performed for them. One example springs to mind. We have a client whose husband died last year. She's recently widowed, and we've been doing a lot of work. Mark Idle in particular has been doing a lot of work on her house. And we were at her house fairly recently, and one of her daughters was there, and we were looking to do some more work for her. And her daughter, we walked in the door. Her daughter just caught Mark, like stared at him, like stared him down eye to eye, and was just like, "Thank you so much for taking care of my mom." And it was a really, really, really awesome moment. I think particularly for Mark, it's just really gratifying to see that after all the work he's done. But again, I'm thinking, like, we've made a considerable amount of money off this woman, which isn't a bad thing. It's not bad that we can, that we make money, that we can provide for our families. And because we've done the work well, because we've sought the flourishing of others in our work, it's almost like she feels like she's gotten more than what she's paid for, and yet we've also made a profit. Everyone is flourishing in that moment in a really genuine way. And I think that's just so cool how work done well makes that happen. I think, personally, I thought another example is, I think of the staff at Dornbecker Hospital when Faye was in the hospital. I think of how thankful I am for those doctors and nurses. I think of how thankful I am for that hospital. They made a lot of money, not necessarily off of us, but our insurance and us. But I don't feel that at all. I don't feel far from feeling taken advantage of by them. I feel blessed by them. I feel blessed by the work they did. And I think when work is done well, it contributes to the flourishing of everyone. And the way we do this is by drawing out the potential of the domain. The potential of the job is another way to say it. Every job has the potential to contribute to this flourishing that we've mentioned. And every job has a unique way, has a unique way of contributing to that flourishing. Again, sort of broadly speaking, doctors help people flourish physically, whereas teachers help people flourish mentally. Garbage men help people flourish by consolidating and disposing of refuse so that we don't have to walk through trash all day long. You get the point. There's unique ways in which jobs contribute to the flourishing of everyone. So I work with a number of people, again, in my job, my craftsmen particularly. And even though I work in tandem with my craftsmen for a common goal, me and my craftsmen, we're associated with different sort of aspects of our clients' flourishing. For instance, my craftsmen are more closely associated with the feeling of excitement our clients get when they see a well-performed repair. When we patch a piece of drywall and you can't even see where the hole in the wall was anymore, that's kind of exciting for a lot of our clients. Or I had some clients who just we hung some mirrors for them, and just having nicely hung level mirrors was so exciting for them. And my craftsmen, the people who are actually doing that work, they're really closely associated with that sense of excitement. Whereas because I'm the one that they call to get work done, I'm going to be more closely associated with the sense of comfort that they get knowing that they have a resource they can call and get their home repaired, that they can get those beautiful repairs done. And so even though we work close together, me and my craftsmen, we contribute to the overall flourishing in different ways, in unique ways. And so every job or every domain has a unique combination of ways in which it can contribute to the overall flourishing of everyone. And we draw out this potential by rearranging the raw materials. And so, just as every domain has a unique potential, every domain also has unique raw materials. And so the question to ask here is really simple. What are my raw materials? What am I working with? In my case, my raw materials are contractors and craftsmen, various forms of technology that we use in the office, and the homes that we work on, the physical tools we use to do the repairs, and so on. So the goal of my job, I can rearrange some of my raw materials by, for instance, using some of our technology to set reminders for me to schedule, annual services for my clients that will maintain their home and save them from having to do a larger, more costly repair down the line. A quick story on that. When we were living out in Silverton, our house was on a part of our roof was missing a really pretty, it's a piece of flashing, so it's a pretty small piece of metal to kick out flashing, so it directs water into the gutters is basically the idea. My house was missing that in one spot, which meant that when it rained, as it often does in Oregon, the water was pouring down the side of my wall and getting into all the cracks and stuff and causing rot was the long and short of it. And so because I was missing what is probably a, $5 to $10 piece of metal on my roof, I ended up having to pay thousands of dollars to have that rot cut out of my house and replaced with good materials. And so by setting little reminders for my clients, by rearranging some of my raw materials, I can instead give them the $10 piece of metal and put that on their roof so that they don't have to do the $1,000, the multi-$1,000 repair down the line. So that's just one example. And in that example, I have, again, ensured my client has a secure home, that my craftsmen have work, that my employer makes a profit and gets a good reputation, and that I get to keep a job and provide for my family. Flourishing of everyone. And the beauty is that I can spend my entire life, all of us could spend our entire lives in our jobs, rearranging those raw materials and exploring the potential of our given domain to contribute to the flourishing of everyone. So I think that's Keller's definition. I think it does a good job of capturing sort of the essence of Luther's view of work. The beauty of this view is that it really does come right from the Bible, which again, as Vlad mentioned, that was what the Reformers were all about, getting back to the Bible. So I think we can see this in broad strokes, like I've kind of talked about already, that in the beginning, God created the world to display his glory. He set man up to be a steward of the temple of the world. Sin caused separation. Man lost his place in that temple of the world. But the work of Jesus reversed it, and now man can reclaim his role as a steward of God's glory. And work is the most practical expression of that role as a priest of God. That's what it means that is part of what it means that Christians we're a kingdom of priests. We're a kingdom of priests We're working in the temple of the world to the glory of God, to run it as he designed it to be run. And every job has potential to contribute to the flourishing of everyone and the glory of God in the running of the cosmos. Specifically, I want to look at Jeremiah to just real briefly. We see this, I think there might not be a more clear expression of God's desire that we seek the flourishing of the world than in Jeremiah. And realize that Jeremiah was writing to Israel during the Babylonian exile. So they were living in Babylon, and some of the leaders in Babylon, some of the Jewish leaders in Babylon at the time were telling people to sort of keep separate from the Babylonians, don't engage too much, don't get too involved in the city. God's going to get us out of here at any moment. And so, just kind of keep ourselves separate, right? Again, the sacred secular divide. And Jeremiah, in that context, says this: seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. In its welfare you will find your welfare. And this is remarkably similar to our situation as Christians today, and very similar to Luther's view of vocation as well. As Christians, we're sojourners. We're strangers. We're kind of in exile. The kingdom is already inaugurated, not yet consummated. And so we are the people of God living in a foreign land. This is not our home. We're in exile. So, because we, like Israel, are in exile and sojourners in the world, so we, like Israel, are called to seek the welfare of the world in which we wander until God sees fit to call us home. We're here to seek the welfare of the world in which we wander. And so, with our whole lives and with our jobs specifically, we work for the flourishing of everyone and the glory of God. And I think in this, we have the answer to the views of work in our culture. The view of work as identity, or the view of work as drudgery. You see, because we relish our work. It's not drudgery, we relish it. We're working with God for his purpose, for the flourishing of others, for his glory. And we enjoy that work. We can look back and see the goodness of that work, just as God did. All the while, though, we recognize that that work is ultimately for the glory of God. It's an act of worship to him, not something to be worshiped in place of him. And so we relish our work, but we recognize that it's an act of worship to God. So the call of Luther, the call of the Bible, is to work heartily and joyfully, not because our job defines us, but because God, the God who saved us, allows us to join him in his creative redemption of the world. I want to wrap up by reading a quote from Dorothy L. Sayers that I think sums up the call perfectly and beautifully. She says, "Christians must revive a centuries-old view of humankind as made in the image of God, the eternal craftsman, and of work as a source of fulfillment and blessing, not as a necessary drudgery to be undergone for the purpose of making money, but as a way of life in which the nature of man should find its proper exercise and delight, and so fulfill itself to the glory of God. That it should, in fact, be thought of as a creative activity undertaken for the love of the work itself, and that man, made in God's image, should make things as God makes them, or made in God's image should work as God works, for the sake of doing well a thing that is well worth doing." Let me pray for us. Father, I know I know that I can confess that that I often fall into the cultural views of work, but I see the beauty of what you call us to in our work. I see the beauty of joining with you in your work in the world. And so I pray for us now, God. I pray for myself that we would answer that incarnational call that is so clearly exemplified in Jesus taking on flesh and coming to the world. May we go to the world in our work for the flourishing of everyone and ultimately for your glory. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.